We're talking about the dilemma and with the case of the Iran and the United States. Go
Okay.
ahead.
Well, we kind of in our brainstorming we were doing, we came to the conclusion that there were two big dilemmas in the Middle East situation, and one of them was in Saudi Arabia, and the other was in the United States, and with Trump, and Trump faces a dilemma, and so does Saudi Arabia faces another big dilemma. And what's the source of the dilemma? It's a common source. It's Israel.
Mm.
So we've and it fits into a general pattern that we've talked about over the months, and that is the the Israelis do have a plan. I said before, Trump doesn't have a plan. He doesn't know what the word plan means. But the Israelis do have a plan, and they know what the word plan means. And the plan is to destroy Iran as it's currently constituted, not only in terms of its current governance regime, but geographically. Break it up in little pieces.
Yeah. The the problem right now, for Israel, it seems to me that there are two countries that are big and militarily when it comes to their population, Turkey and Iran. Both of them, it seems to have Israel is talking about both of them are the enemies of Israel. But when it comes to Iran and the way that Donald Trump is continuing the war, do you think that after all, he's going to be forced by the economy, by the reality of the Strait of Hormuz? And the case of the oil market is so important right now. In the last 24 hours, there were three attacks, American attacks on Iranians. It wasn't significant comparing to the last 4 days. It wasn't that much. In last night, as I've mentioned, Channel 11 of Israel reported that they were supposed to have a massive attack on Iran, and but it didn't happen. What is happening considering the oil market, considering the economy, and the continuation of the war, in your opinion?
Well, I think it's just this fundamental dilemma and a power struggle in Trump's own mind, and that is it's the U.S. economy, the U.S. voters, the U.S. public on the one hand, and on the other hand, Israel and Israel's plan, and Israel's plan, of course, that Israel has effective enforcers in the United States, and it's called the Israel lobby. They have a lot of power. Look at what happened in the House vote last week. There were two provisions in the House vote that on the defense spending bill that basically embeds the Israeli army into the U.S. Army, integrates it, and it passed. There was no debate. And why and where did these provisions come from? They're all drafted by the Israel lobby and friends of the Israel lobby. Now, who are friends of the Israel lobby? Well, they're U.S. congressmen and senators who receive campaign money. It's about money. You ask, well, how do they have so much power? Well, they have a lot of money and they know how to spend it. So the lobby is a very effective one. It's probably the most powerful lobby in the United States, probably, and it directly affects everything going on in the Middle East, for sure. So on the side, by the way, a footnote on this: if you listen to the interviews of retired generals and admirals in the United States, they've been laying out all the options, the military options that Trump has, and they tend to be very aggressive. You have to realize generals and admirals aren't the sharpest knives in the drawer, but they give the advice. And the advice is Trump will come in and say, well, what are my options militarily? And it's very clear when you listen to these retired officers from the United States military that they have a whole range of things that would go way up the escalation ladder, and not only go up the escalation ladder, but spread things. Now we spread things like, for sure, part of the Saudi attack on the Houthis was instigated via the United States. Now, let me ask you a question. Very interesting. Do you think that Israel had anything to do with this? So you see the network, how the thing works.
Hmm.
And speaking of Israel, by the way, and real estate, because it's a lot of it's basically just a real estate, a land deal. You saw what happened in the West Bank yesterday, and that's just standard operating procedure. The settlers, you've got what, 800,000 settlers who have settled into the West Bank, which they're not supposed to be there in the first place, but they're there. It's facts on the ground. They're there. And what they do is, at a minimum, provoke the Palestinian residents that are on the West Bank, and they provoke. They and when they provoke, they always call in the Israeli Defense Forces to back them up, and the Israeli Defense Forces back them up. Well, yesterday there was a little trouble because one of the Palestinians grabbed one of the weapons of the Israeli troops and shot two Israelis. So there were four Palestinians that were shot in the provocation itself, but there was a follow up, and of course, if you listen to the Western media, it's very hard to figure out actually what's going on, because the reporting is so muddled and confusing on purpose. It's not clear. It's clear actually if you sit down and think about it, because that is the standard operating procedure. Provoke, get a reaction, and now I haven't checked this morning, but yesterday they went into a full terrorist alert, the Israelis, and uh, further rampage through the West Bank. But it's a little like Gaza. If you make the territory unlivable, no one's going to be living there, and then you take the land.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you make of those people who are arguing, still arguing, comparing the war with Vietnam, with other wars, and arguing it's time, right now, it's time to escalate and put troops underground? And looking at the targets in the southern part of Iran, in the western part of Iran, you feel somehow maybe the Trump administration is trying to do that. But there are people seriously arguing, like General Keith Kellogg, for example, is arguing that this is the time put troops underground, maybe get the Hark Island, and then the Qeshm Island, and then controlling the Strait of Hormuz. What do you make of these arguments? Are they really think that it's all about buying time, or maybe feeling if you put troops underground, you have huge casualties, that's going to bring the support to the war?
Well, this is basically the military boneheads giving advice. I told you before, when they're interviewed on TV, most of the retired high-ranking officers in the United States, they 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 they, they take the all-in approach, the kind of Vietnam approach, or the Afghan approach. I mean, they have a history ever since the Second World War. We've basically lost every military engagement we've ever been in, and so why do you pay much attention to the generals? I don't. it doesn't make any sense. They would have to explain why they're so convinced that this would be a slam dunk, or as Paul Wolfowitz said in Iraq, a cakewalk. You know, remember the cakewalk? And they're talking. By the way, I heard a general yesterday on Fox News, and he was indicating that one thing that we should be doing is getting the Kurds in Iraq to insert, and in Turkey to insert themselves in Iran and be part of the battle. But earlier reports have indicated that the Iranians have figured that out. And they pretty much knocked out the capacity of the Kurds to do much. But here you have a U.S. general saying, "Oh, you got to get in there and get the Kurds going." And then he did have a little footnote at the end. He said, "Well, you'd have to get the Turkish government and Erdogan on board before you actually did that." He didn't know if Erdogan would approve of that. I can tell you what the answer to that is. It doesn't take a genius to figure that out. But you have all these military options. That's what they spend all their time thinking of ways to insert the military and go up the escalation ladder, which I think is a foolish thing in this case, because going up the escalation ladder has proven to be a disaster. Not only in the current situation, but also in past engagements that the U.S. has, past wars, engagements, whatever you want to call it. They haven't worked. And let's think of the thing, Nima, in kind of simple terms, and that is, what was the situation before the war of choice started on February 28th? All these problems have been created by who? Who has shut the straits? The United States and Israel have shut the straits. It always is presented in the media as if Iran shut the straits. No, if there wasn't a war of choice, the straits would be open. There wasn't any problem in the straits before the war started. Now there's a problem.
Yeah, exactly. How do you see the position of GCC countries? From what we're hearing from them, nobody's happy with the current situation, but they're part of the war. They're the battlefield right now as time goes by. You know, the attack on Bahrain, Kuwait, Jordan, and it's gonna get, if the war escalates, it's gonna get to Saudi Arabia and Qatar as well. And their economy is under tremendous pressure because of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. And right now the Red Sea is coming again and hitting the Saudi economy. What do they have? How can they somehow change the mindset of Washington? Do they have that sort of influence in Washington?
I think the answer to that is no. They're certainly no match for the Israel lobby. There's no, if those are the two options, forget it. The Israel lobby will win out in the day, and you have to remember that the not only the Gulf, and I know something about the Gulf Cooperation Council, for example, that is an organization, but they don't accomplish very much. They end up fighting among themselves and so forth. And I know this because from 2008 until 2014, I was on the UAE's Financial Advisory Council. I was a member, so I have a somewhat of an idea of how it works. And these Gulf states spend most of their time quibbling amongst themselves. The idea that it's some unified, shall we say, agglomeration of nation states is not correct. I don't think they have much influence, honestly, and they have the dilemma too, and that the dilemma is the same one that Trump has in a way, and that is the economy. Trump wants the economy to boom and not be interfered with by high oil prices, fertilizer prices, grain prices, all of these problems. But that's one side of the dilemma. The other side is what Israel wants him to do, which is exactly the opposite. They want him to go up the escalation ladder. He wants to get off of the ladder completely, but he's got a dilemma, and as a result, and he has no plan of his own. He has no independent plan. So that's why things shift from day to day. They One day he's on one side of the dilemma, the next day he's on the other side of the dilemma. Now, if you look at the Gulf states, they kind of have the same thing, because they want their economies going and not being interrupted with, but that's on one side, so they want things to wind down. But on the other side, they're being pushed, and this, by the way, is largely by the United States, but indirectly behind the curtain you have Israel. They're pushed to do what? Attack. The Kuwaitis were we're attacking. The UAE has been attacking. They've been facilitating these things. So how can you have your cake and eat it too? They can't. And by the way, the Gulf has big long-term problems, because the collateral damage of this war long term will be big time, because, for example, Dubai and the UAE is a big logistical hub. They're very well located from a logistical point of view. But what happens after the war? The risk isn't going to go away. The insurance premiums aren't going to go away, and people are going to decide, oh, what's happening? There are a lot of operations in Dubai that are moving to Istanbul. Turkey looks much more attractive than it did before. As far as I'm concerned, of course, Turkey's always attractive.
How do you see the long-term influence or the consequences of the war on a country like UAE? You mentioned what is happening in UAE, but as time goes by and you see the difficulties, and they're so close to Israel, we know that the difference between Saudi Arabia and UAE is that UAE is somehow closer to Israel than Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is somehow, it has its own policy, and they're fighting each other, by the way, as you've mentioned. The two are fighting each other in Yemen, they're fighting each other in Somalia, in Libya, and Sudan, exactly. And
so
what would happen to them, to basically to UAE, as an outcome of this war?
well, I think my view is the outcome is negative on UAE long term. Very, very negative. And by the way, one thing that's interesting, if you look at the growth in the UAE, you start from the great financial crisis in 2008, and you index the GDP per capita at 100 at 2008, which I've done, and then you run it out to the end of 2025, and it actually is decreased a little bit. It's been flatlined in the UAE. The number's around 97. So if you have an index number that's 100 in 2008, and that's the GDP per capita measured on purchasing power parity basis, which neutralizes for exchange rate changes in the countries involved, you end up with that thing sliding down a little bit. It's not going up. What is the fastest growing country from a GDP per capita based on purchasing power parity since 2008? It's Iran. Iran is one. It goes from 100 to 117. Saudi Arabia is number two. It goes from 100 to about 114. Kuwait is a complete disaster. It goes from 100 to 67. Kuwait, they're big time. Oman goes down. The precise number off the top of my head, I can't remember. Oman goes down. Qatar goes down. They all go. They're all negative except two. Iran is number one, and Saudis are number two. And this is another piece of disinformation that's out there. Remember, everyone was telling us that Iran, the economy had collapsed. Well, it hadn't collapsed. It hadn't grown very fast, but it had grown faster than every single country, including Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. And that's another factor behind. You say, well, what are the Gulf countries going to do? How are they going to react? And what's the long-term prospect and so forth? Well, starting even from the great financial crisis, it wasn't what it was advertised to be. And incidentally, in Kuwait, it's a place I know a little bit about because I was served on the international board of the National Bank of Kuwait for a number of years. So I have a fairly good idea of their problems, but they're pretty severe, actually. Kuwait, of all the Gulf countries, Kuwait is got the biggest batch of troubles economically. And now you see the U.S. has them involved covertly. They weren't too covert. Believe me, the Iranians knew exactly what was going on. Why do you think they're hitting Kuwait so hard? Everybody wonders, well, why do they keep hitting Kuwait? Why do they keep hitting Kuwait? Because Kuwait hits them. It's very interesting. In this whole thing, the media has the first mover upside down. The first mover has been the West. The second mover has been Iran. And it was the same way with the MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding. If you go through that, the first mover to break away, before it was even signed, by the way, because one of the provisions in the MOU was that Israel would knock it off in Lebanon. They would Lebanon and the Hezbollah was part of the MOU, and that was under a ceasefire. Well, the ceasefire, it never existed. It never happened. As they were signing the MOU, Israel was bombing civilian targets in southern Lebanon. And still to this day, almost every day, the Israeli bulldozers are in there knocking down residences, homes.
Yeah. Do you think that the this war? I don't know how long is the. Do you see the possibility of an endless war in the West Asia between Iran and the United States?
I see that. Let's not. They're kind of, shall we say, degrees of things. I mean, we've been in a war with Iran ever since the revolution. So that, but it's kind of usually pretty low level. I mean, we're not flying jets in every night bombing things. So you've got kind of a cold war or a shall we say a standoff to a hot war, and I think the whole region will remain in a cold war. No, that would be the best case solution, and the reason for that is, and I think I went through this with you the last time we talked. If you look at the main factors that have to be solved before a Cold War would disappear. So it was stable. I figured the probability of all those key factors and did a joint probability calculation, and it's way less than 1% chance. It actually, the way I did it, just back of the envelope, it was 3% of 1%, 3% of 1%, that things would be settled down in the region. So things are not going to be settled down in the region. There's no question about that. The question is how hot the war is going to be. And the US is totally entangled in the thing because of Israel. Just look at this bill that was passed in the House, US House. It'll probably be passed in the Senate and signed by the president, that will integrate to a greater, more explicit degree than they're already integrated in the U.S. military, the Israeli Defense Forces.